Here's what Jung understood that the spiritual marketplace desperately hides. Awakening is subtractive, not additive. It's not about what you gain, it's about what you're willing to lose. Think about how modern spirituality operates. It's an accumulation game. More practices, more teachers, more retreats, more books, more techniques, more consciousness. As if transformation is a building project where you keep adding floors until you reach enlightenment. But Jung watched his patients carefully. The ones who genuinely transformed weren't the ones with the most practices. They were the ones who'd stopped practicing, not from laziness or giving up, but from recognizing that practices themselves had become obstacles. He noticed something profound. There's a phase in spiritual development where addition works, and a phase where only subtraction works. Most seekers never make the transition. They stay in accumulation mode forever, collecting practices, teachers, experiences, insights, never realizing that accumulation itself is preventing awakening. Jung called this the spiritual burden, when all your practices, identities, and pursuits become psychological weight that prevents the very lightness they promised. You're carrying so much spirituality that you can't be spontaneous, so much consciousness that you can't be natural, so much awakening that you can't be yourself. Real awakening requires recognizing what needs to be eliminated. And Jung identified 5 specific things that awakened people quietly let go of, things most seekers consider non-negotiable. Let's start with the first one. The first thing awakened people eliminate sounds paradoxical, but once you understand why, you'll see it's the most important elimination of all. They eliminate their spiritual identity, the image of themselves as awakened, conscious, or enlightened. Because that identity is the ego's most sophisticated survival mechanism, most spiritual seekers are building an identity. I'm a meditator. I'm on the spiritual path. I'm more conscious than most people. I'm awakening. This identity feels important, like evidence of growth, proof of progress, confirmation you're different from the asleep masses. But Jung discovered, the spiritual identity is the ego wearing spiritual clothing. It's not awakening, it's ego inflation disguised as consciousness. And it's more dangerous than the normal ego because it's invisible to itself. Think of it like wearing a costume of enlightenment. You put on robes, speak in calm tones, radiate serenity. But underneath, you're still the same person who wants to be seen as special. The costume becomes so convincing that you forget you're wearing it. You believe you are the enlightened character you're playing. But awakening isn't putting on a better costume. It's taking off all costumes entirely, including the spiritual one. And most people would rather perfect their spiritual costume than stand without one. Here's how it operates. The normal ego identifies with achievements, status, relationships. When those identities are threatened, the ego defends them. The spiritual ego does the same thing, but with spiritual markers. It identifies with being awakened, integrated, conscious. And when that identity is threatened, it defends just as aggressively. Jung saw this constantly. Patients who had achieved genuine insights would unconsciously turn those insights into identity. They'd become the person who's integrated their shadow, the one who's more conscious, the awakened being surrounded by sleepers. Same ego patterns, just spiritualized. One of Jung's patients perfectly captured this trap. A man who'd spent 10 years in spiritual practice, meditation, shadow work, therapy, achieved profound realizations. But Jung noticed something. Every conversation, he'd subtly reference his spiritual development. Every interaction, he'd position himself as more conscious. Every conflict, he'd frame others as still asleep while he was awake to the patterns. Jung confronted him. You haven't transcended your ego. You've given it a spiritual promotion. You're not awake, you're identified with being awake, and that identification is keeping you asleep. The man was devastated, then defensive, then eventually willing to see. His entire spiritual journey had been the ego's strategy to feel special, superior, significant. He wasn't pursuing awakening, he was pursuing spiritual status. And that pursuit was the opposite of awakening. Real awakening requires eliminating the spiritual identity entirely, not replacing normal ego with spiritual ego, but recognizing that any identity, spiritual or otherwise, is ego. The awakened person doesn't identify as awakened. They don't think of themselves as conscious or enlightened. They have dropped all identity, including the spiritual one. When you eliminate spiritual identity, something shifts. You stop needing to signal your consciousness. Stop positioning yourself as more aware. Stop judging others' level of development. You just are, without the story of being awakened. If eliminating spiritual identity sounds difficult, this second elimination is even harder because it requires giving up the very behaviors most people use to prove their spirituality. Awakened people eliminate performative spirituality. All the signaling, displaying, and performing that broadcasts "I'm spiritual," because they recognize it as ego maintenance disguised as practice. Think about how spirituality functions socially. People signal their consciousness through behavior. They speak in spiritual language, reference teachings, display practices, share insights, perform peace, radiate calmness, demonstrate non-judgment. Every action broadcasts, "I'm awakened, conscious, evolved." This isn't malicious, it's unconscious. The ego has learned that spiritual performance gets validation, status, belonging. So it performs spirituality while calling it authenticity. Jung identified specific patterns of performative spirituality. Spiritual language, using terms like the universe, vibration, alignment, shadow work, in ways that signal membership rather than genuine experience. Peace performance. Maintaining serene affect even when authenticity would mean showing frustration or intensity. Wisdom dispensing. Constantly offering spiritual insights in conversations. Using others' problems to demonstrate your awareness. Non-judgment performance. Claiming "I don't judge" while internally judging constantly. Surrender theater. Talking about surrender and letting go while controlling everything. These aren't intentionally fake. They're the ego's sophisticated adaptation to spiritual culture. The ego learns that spiritual performance is rewarded, so it performs spirituality while remaining fundamentally unchanged. Jung watched this in his practice constantly. One patient, a spiritual teacher, appeared deeply awakened, spoke beautifully about presence, embodiment, shadow integration. Her students revered her consciousness. But in private sessions with Jung, she admitted, "I'm performing spirituality all day. Every word is calculated to appear wise. Every gesture designed to radiate peace. I'm exhausted from maintaining the performance, and I can't stop because my entire identity depends on it." Through analysis, she discovered her spirituality was entirely performative, a sophisticated strategy to get validation, status, and belonging. She wasn't being spiritual. She was performing what spiritual communities rewarded, and that performance prevented genuine awakening. Real awakening requires eliminating performative spirituality entirely, not replacing it with more authentic performance, but dropping the performance altogether. Speaking normally, being authentically messy, showing frustration when frustrated, admitting confusion, expressing intensity, being human rather than performing enlightenment. Jung noticed that truly awakened people looked surprisingly normal. They didn't radiate spiritual energy or speak in profound tones. They didn't signal consciousness or display awakening. They were just themselves. Authentic, immediate, unfiltered, no performance. When you eliminate performative spirituality, you lose spiritual status but gain authenticity. You stop being impressive and start being real. And that's when actual awakening becomes possible, because you're no longer maintaining the ego structure through spiritual performance. The first two eliminations strip away identity and performance, but this third one cuts even deeper, removing something most seekers don't realize they're still dependent on. Awakened people eliminate the need for external validation of their spiritual state. They stop seeking confirmation, recognition, or approval of their consciousness from others. Most spiritual seekers are unconsciously seeking external validation. They want others to recognize their growth, acknowledge their consciousness, confirm their awakening. They share insights hoping for recognition. Practice meditation, hoping others notice their peace. Integrate shadow, hoping people see their maturity. The entire journey becomes oriented around external confirmation. Am I awakened yet? Can you see my consciousness? Do you recognize how far I've come? This isn't conscious. It's a deep need for validation that spiritual identity is real. Jung discovered this through a simple test. He'd ask patients, if no one ever acknowledged your spiritual development, if no one saw your consciousness, recognized your growth, or validated your awakening, would you continue? Most couldn't answer honestly, because they'd unconsciously organized their spirituality around external validation. They needed others to see their consciousness to feel conscious, required recognition of their awakening to believe in it. This creates a trap. You're not awakening for awakening's sake. You're awakening for validation, not transforming because transformation feels true, but because transformation gets recognized. Your entire spiritual journey becomes dependent on others reflecting back your spiritual status. It's like learning to play an instrument only when people are listening. You practice when others can hear, perfect your performance for an audience, play only pieces that impress, but you never sit alone with the instrument just for the joy of making music. You've made your entire relationship with music dependent on applause. And awakening that requires applause isn't awakening, it's performance art. One of Jung's patients, a man who'd spent years in spiritual communities, discovered this painfully. He'd achieved genuine insights, done real shadow work, experienced authentic transformation. But Jung noticed, he constantly needed to share his realizations, teach his insights, demonstrate his consciousness. Every breakthrough was immediately broadcast for validation. Jung asked him, what would happen if you kept your next realization completely private, told no one, shared nothing, received zero recognition? Could you do it? The man tried, and within days felt desperate to share. He realized his spirituality was entirely validation dependent. He didn't trust his own consciousness. He needed others to confirm it. Every insight felt incomplete until recognized. Real awakening requires eliminating the need for external validation. Not because validation is bad, but because dependency on it prevents genuine internal authority. The awakened person doesn't need others to recognize their consciousness. They don't even think about whether others recognize it. Jung observed this in truly transformed patients. They'd achieve profound realizations and simply sit with them. No need to share, teach, or broadcast. Their spirituality became entirely internal, independent of external validation. When you eliminate external validation, your spirituality becomes invisible. Others might not know you're conscious at all, and you're completely fine with that, because you're not identifying with consciousness or seeking confirmation of it. If you're recognizing yourself in these patterns, maintaining spiritual identity, performing spirituality, seeking validation for your consciousness, you're not failing. You're seeing the sophisticated ways ego survives through spirituality. Jung believed these eliminations aren't about becoming better or more spiritual. They're about seeing through the ego's strategies so clearly that you can't participate in them anymore. Not from effort, but from recognition. Before we explore the final two eliminations that reveal what awakened people let go of to be genuinely free, check out our new guide, True Self-Discovery, with 24 practical reflection exercises designed to help you find your way within. Click below to get True Self-Discovery. Let's continue, because these final eliminations show what real spiritual maturity actually looks like. The first three eliminations stripped away identity, performance, and validation. But this fourth one removes the entire structure most people build their spiritual life on. Awakened people eliminate spiritual materialism, the collecting, consuming, and accumulating of spiritual experiences, practices, teachers, and insights as if awakening is something you can possess. Spiritual materialism is the ego's adaptation to spiritual culture. It operates like regular materialism, accumulating objects, experiences, status markers, but with spiritual content. Instead of collecting cars, you collect practices. Instead of designer brands, you collect famous teachers. Instead of luxury experiences, you collect mystical states. Jung noticed this everywhere in spiritual communities. People bragging about their meditation hours like others brag about income. Collecting certifications, trainings, retreats like others collect degrees. Name-dropping teachers like others name-drop connections. Comparing spiritual experiences like others compare possessions. The content is spiritual, but the psychology is pure materialism. More is better, rarer is more valuable, acquiring is progressing, possessing is achieving. This manifests in specific patterns. Practice collecting, accumulating meditation techniques, breathwork methods, shadow work tools, not because you deeply practice any of them, but because having more feels like progressing. Teacher shopping, constantly seeking new teachers, each one promising the final breakthrough. The ego loves this because it feels like seeking, while ensuring you never fully commit to any path that might actually transform you. Experience hunting, chase and peak experiences, mystical states, profound insights, collecting them like stamps, using them as evidence of spiritual advancement. Insight hoarding, constantly consuming spiritual content, videos, books, podcasts, accumulating ideas. The mind becomes a spiritual library while the being remains unchanged. Jung saw this as the ego's brilliant strategy. It learns to seek awakening in ways that prevent awakening, because as long as you're accumulating, you're not surrendering. As long as you're collecting experiences, you're not being present. As long as you're consuming teachings, you're not embodying silence. One patient came to Jung after decades of spiritual seeking. He'd studied with dozens of teachers, completed countless retreats, accumulated certifications in multiple modalities, had powerful mystical experiences. He seemed spiritually wealthy until he broke down. "I've been collecting spirituality like others collect money. More practices, more teachers, more experiences. But I'm not transformed. I'm just a spiritual hoarder who's accumulated so much that I can't move." Through analysis, Jung showed him that spiritual materialism was the ego's way of feeling progress while preventing transformation. Every new practice became something else to manage rather than integrate. Every new teacher became another authority to depend on rather than finding internal authority. Every experience became another trophy rather than genuine dissolution. Real awakening requires eliminating spiritual materialism entirely, not acquiring more, but letting go of the need to acquire, not collecting practices, but deepening into one or none, not chasing experiences, but being with what is, not accumulating insights, but embodying simple truths. Jung observed that truly awakened people lived with remarkable spiritual simplicity. They didn't have elaborate practices, long lists of teachers, or impressive spiritual resumes. They'd eliminated the accumulation and lived from a simple, embodied presence that required nothing external. When you eliminate spiritual materialism, you lose the feeling of spiritual progress. You can't measure consciousness by what you've acquired, but you gain something better, the simplicity that allows presence, no longer maintaining a spiritual empire, just being what you are. If the previous eliminations challenged everything you're doing spiritually, this final one removes the foundation itself, and it's the elimination that makes all others possible. Awakened people eliminate the spiritual search itself, the seeking, pursuing, and striving for awakening. Because they recognize that the seeker seeking is the obstacle, and the search itself prevents finding. This is the most counterintuitive elimination because spiritual culture is organized around seeking enlightenment, pursuing awakening, striving for consciousness. The entire industry depends on keeping people in permanent search mode, always seeking, never finding. But Jung discovered something profound. The spiritual search is the ego's strategy to defer awakening indefinitely. As long as you're seeking, awakening is future. As long as you're pursuing consciousness, presence is delayed. As long as you're striving for enlightenment, you're reinforcing the one who's unenlightened. Here's the trap. Who's seeking awakening? The ego. Who's pursuing enlightenment? The identity seeking transformation. Who's striving for consciousness? The unconscious mind looking for escape. The very thing seeking is the thing that needs to end. But it can't end itself by seeking harder. Think of it like trying to find silence by making noise. The louder you search, the more you create the very thing blocking what you're seeking. Every spiritual effort is noise. Every practice is sound. Every seeking movement creates disturbance. And what you're looking for, silence, presence, awakening, can only be found when the searching stops. But the ego can't accept this because stopping the search feels like giving up. So it keeps making noise, louder and louder, wondering why it can't find silence. Jung watched this repeatedly. Patients would seek intensely, more practices, deeper commitment, harder work. And the harder they sought, the more distant awakening became. Why? Because seeking itself reinforces the seeker. Every spiritual practice confirms there's someone practicing. Every meditation reinforces there's a meditator. Every moment seeking awakening proves you're not awakened. It's a psychological trap. You can't seek your way to awakening because seeking presupposes separation, the seeker and the sought, the one who's unawakened and the awakening they're pursuing. As long as that duality exists, awakening can't happen, because awakening is the dissolution of the seeker itself. One of Jung's patients spent 15 years seeking enlightenment. Meditation, retreats, teachers, practices, absolute dedication. But nothing happened. Through analysis with Jung, he had a devastating realization. My seeking has been my safety. As long as I'm seeking, I feel like I'm making progress. I'm on the path. I'm a spiritual person. But if I stop seeking, who would I be? The seeking has become my identity, and finding would destroy me. Jung told him something radical. Stop seeking for 1 month. No practices, no reading, no spiritual input. Just live. See what happens when the seeker stops seeking. The patient tried. At first he felt lost, anxious, purposeless. His entire life had been organized around seeking. Without it, he felt like nothing. But then something shifted. Without the constant seeking, without the perpetual striving, without the endless pursuit, presence emerged naturally. Not from effort, but from the absence of effort. Real awakening requires eliminating the spiritual search entirely. Not seeking better or more authentically, but recognizing that seeking itself is the obstacle. The awakened aren't people who found what they were seeking. They're people who stopped seeking and recognized what was already present. When you eliminate the search, you lose the structure that's organized your spiritual life. No more path, no more progress, no more pursuit. But you gain what the search was always looking for, the recognition that you were never not awake. You were just identified with the one seeking awakening. Let me synthesize what awakened people quietly eliminate. 1. The spiritual identity, recognizing that identifying as awakened is ego inflation, not consciousness. 2. Performative spirituality, dropping all signaling, displaying, and demonstrating of consciousness. 3. External validation, eliminating dependency on others, recognizing or confirming your spiritual state. 4. Spiritual materialism, letting go of accumulating practices, experiences, teachers, and insights. 5. The search itself, recognizing that seeking awakening reinforces the seeker and prevents presence. These eliminations are radical because they remove everything most people consider essential to spiritual life. No identity, no performance, no validation, no accumulation, no seeking. What's left? Jung would say, what's left is what was always there. Presence, being, consciousness that doesn't need to be sought, because it's already the case. These eliminations don't create awakening. They remove the obstacles to recognizing what was never absent. The spiritual identity blocked natural being. The performance prevented authenticity. The validation prevented internal authority. The materialism prevented simplicity. The seeking prevented presence. When you eliminate these 5 things, you're not becoming more spiritual. You're becoming less encumbered by spirituality. Not more conscious, just less identified with consciousness seeking. Not more awakened, just less committed to being a seeker. And paradoxically, that's when awakening becomes possible. not as achievement but as recognition, not as something gained through elimination, but as what remains when the eliminable is eliminated. If these eliminations confronted you, Jung would say, you're seeing how the ego survives through spirituality. Every identity, performance, validation seeking, accumulation, and search is the ego maintaining itself while claiming to seek its dissolution. Real awakening requires recognizing these patterns so clearly that you can't maintain them anymore. Not through more seeking, but through seeing so deeply that the game becomes impossible to play. The 5 eliminations aren't a new practice to accumulate. They are recognitions that naturally lead to letting go. Your spiritual identity is ego inflation. Drop it. Your spiritual performance is authenticity avoidance. Stop it. Your validation seeking is authority abdication. End it. Your spiritual materialism is accumulation as avoidance. Release it. Your spiritual seeking is presence prevention. Recognize it. These eliminations strip away everything you've been using to feel spiritual. And that's the point. Because awakening isn't about feeling spiritual. It's about being what you already are when all the spiritual scaffolding is removed. Jung's promise: eliminate these 5 things, and what remains is simpler, quieter, less impressive, but infinitely more real than anything spirituality promised. You won't look awakened, won't feel special, won't have spiritual status or impressive practices, but you'll be present, authentic, internally rooted. And that presence is what all the seeking was looking for. If these eliminations revealed how ego survives through spirituality, subscribe to this channel for Jungian psychology that challenges rather than comforts. To dive even deeper into Jung's revolutionary psychology and what it means for your spiritual awakening, click the recommended video on your screen now.